So in 2016, I was commissioned by Elle Magazine and Hearst Corporation to produce a photo essay in their fashion magazine in their September issue about the Flint Water Crisis. So it had already been going on since 2014, and so 2 years later, I arrived to Flint. At that time, I was thinking about, it took 14 years to make the notion of family with my mother and my grandmother, 3 generations of women in a steel mill town, so how could I possibly follow that up with now dealing with a man-made water crisis in Vehicle City? So I told them I would take the commission if they found me a family of, multiple generations. And so Amber Hassan, who is Shay's manager, was the primary person that was found. And when I arrived to Flint, she decided for health reasons that she preferred me to focus and collaborate with Shay Cobb. And so that's how Shay and I met and how I've built this very robust friendship with a lot of the artists that are there in Flint through Amber and Shay. So when I arrived, as soon as we sat down at the table in Captain Cody's, which is her favorite diner to go to after she drives her first school bus route, we looked at each other, and she was remembering her grandmother, Hazel. It was the death anniversary. And we instantly bonded over our grandmothers. I was raised by my grandmother. So as soon as we had that moment, we knew. And it just made a lot of sense for she and I to collaborate together. And here we are 4 years later. But when I initially had the encounter with Shay, it was for several months that I was photographing Shay with her mother, Miss Renee, and her 8-year-old daughter, Zion. And Shay was faced with the challenge of having to decide to protect her daughter's health, right? Because she's 8 years old, and the issue with lead is in an 8-year-old child, it's going to leach into their brain. It's going to cause cognitive disorders, problems with education, and the American Pediatrics Association has proven that children under 8 exposed to high levels of lead won't graduate high school. So there's all these, serious issues facing her, and so she makes the decision over those several months that we photographed together to produce this photo essay for Elle Magazine to leave her mother and make the reverse migration back to the South, where her father lives on land that his family has always owned. And so that's how we arrive to Mississippi. And I think what's really important and poignant about my desire to go to Mississippi is it couldn't have been more than a week that I was photographing Shay in Flint, and we were in her mother's house where she and Zion were living at the time, and she said she wanted to show me a picture. And I said, okay. She said her father sent her something, sent her a message. And as soon as she showed it to me, I couldn't get this out of my mind. It was a picture that Mr. Smiley decided to send his daughter, and it's a picture of her at the age of 12, kneeling on the ground, taking her first sip of water from a fresh water spring on the land that she's going to inherit. And I just became obsessed with this image. I had never been to the South. My family is from the South, and so this deep curiosity went when I saw that image, and I went back to the editors at Elle and I said, we need to do a part 2. Like, there's another part to this story that is a massive twist and a really empowering ending to the water crisis. They decided, because there was a lot of changeover, especially with the editor-in-chief, and so we were never able to do a part 2. But I wouldn't let it go. So when the piece came out in August of 2016 and ran in print in the September issue, I decided that following spring to go to Mississippi to meet her father, Mr. Smiley, to ask him, how did he know to take a picture when she was 12 and use it all this time later to send it to her with a message that said, this water won't kill you, come home. I mean, the power of that, right? And this is how I know, like universally, if photographs are used in the right context with the right message and the right intention, anyone can do this and empower themselves. And so it's also a nod to him having that forthright understanding and insight to take the photograph years ahead of this crisis and then send it to her to summon her home with his grandbaby. So it was really this desire and fascination and the understanding of the magnitude of someone using a family album photograph to save someone or to spare someone's life that really drove me to make Flint is Family Part 2, which is what you saw me photographing today. And so it's been 4 years, and I've been photographing with Mr. Smalley since 2017, so we're almost going into 2.5, 3 years of me being in his life as well. But I think there's a real power in sharing this narrative and visual storytelling with America to show these kinds of hidden histories and hidden stories that never make it in corporate media or mass media or in Hollywood. You know, with the fact is, you know, Shay's father's family weren't enslaved, and it's 90 acres of land with her own fresh water spring, her own fruit trees. She has 4 Tennessee walking horses, right? The symbolic meaning and power in seeing these kinds of palpable images of young Black women, right? 2 generations of women, and then this beautiful relationship between Shay and her father and the way that Zion looks at both of them. And what you saw me photographing today was really capturing the tenderness between Zion and Mr. Smalley, who she refers to as her papa. When I first met him and interviewed him, it was very clear that, you know, he's a cowboy, and that's how he always has felt. And I've looked at his family album images, and since he was 4 years old, he's been dressed as a cowboy. When his family moved him to the west side of Chicago, he was still dressed as a cowboy. And the sincerity with it. I had never met a Black family, or in particular a Black man in the South, that breeds, trains, and raises Tennessee walking horses. The power and why I'm photographing the horses is they have a very symbolic meaning. Plantations, when you were on a plantation, the overseer would be riding a Tennessee walking horse. And as Mr. Smalley was explaining this morning during the shoot, it's the gait, it's the way that they walk. So they move with this ease and glide across, which would allow the overseer to look over all of the slaves on the plantation. And so for me to photograph Tennessee walking horses in 2020 of a Black man who's a free man, a veteran, who owns all his land, is a retired auto worker, and a proud father and grandfather, there's a real power in that. And again, another hidden narrative. We don't see these kinds of histories. In fact, Black people in America have been denied knowing that, you know, indigenous people and African American cowboys have always existed. And so I think showing it intergenerationally, because not only are the horses Mr. Smalley's, they also belong to Shay and Zion. And so the horses you saw today, the ones I was photographing eating the hay, and then, of course, Jackson, who I did the portrait of Mr. Smalley with, all of them have certificates. They are all descendants of real royalty, of real horses that won so many championships. I even took the time to photograph all of the championships that Mr. Smalley won, and also his son, who also was in that magazine we were looking at, where he won. And he was the only Black rider on the Tennessee walking horses in that competition. And so even the images of seeing Mr. Smalley with horses in Flint, Michigan, right? So when he was forced to go north and ends up working for General Motors in Flint, he had horses up there. And so Shay grew up with the community knowing, like, here's this girl in the neighborhood who has her own horses. And so today you met the three mares, which are Dolly, PT's Miss One of a Kind, and Blue. And then the one that's in the portrait that was nibbling at Mr. Smiley's flannel is Jackson. It's I Am Jackson is his full name. They have these like amazing official names. And so I think that's important to photograph that today and to show America what that means and the power of that image, and also to empower him, right? What he has done is substantial, and the fact that he also has the awareness to train his granddaughter and daughter how to take care of that land, how to take care of the horses, right? They ride on those horses together, they check their whole property together. And then also how to take care of the spring, the water spring, which is on the other side of the road. So they own the other 10 acres across the road as well when we came off the property and turned right. And so I think it's just powerful to see the symbolic meaning and the cultural meaning of those images and the shifting of power in American history and who gets to tell that story and who is seen as a victor, as a hero, as a king, or as a queen. And in this case, it's Zion, right, who is going to be the most empowered because now she has, through these series of photographs we've made for 4 years, regardless of the brutality and the inhumane treatment she is facing in Flint and in Michigan, she is going to inherit that, and she has a bountiful supply, of her own power and autonomy, right? You can't separate man from land, and the fact that this young woman is going to be the queen of that land, I think is substantial and life-changing, and people need to see that. Other people need to be empowered by that and know that this is real, this is tangible, and this exists. Before I even arrived to Flint, and this is in every body of work that I make, before I arrive, they're given information about who I am, links to my website. Then when I do arrive, I don't come with any equipment or a camera. It's literally just me presenting myself to the family. In this case, it was meeting Shay at that diner and just sitting down face to face. And when you are just in tune with someone, like we looked at each other directly into each other's eyes, and it seemed like we were the same, just occupying two different bodies. Same spirit, two different bodies. So there was a deep connection that was just undeniable for us. But in general, in my practice, not only do we send my information and a link for people to look on their own, also after I meet them for the first time, I'll give them a copy of The Notion of Family so they can see. So after Shay and I had our first meeting, I gave her a copy of The Notion of Family so she could get a sense of, how I would be going about constructing this, photo essay. But in all cases, remembering that The Notion of Family took 14 years to make, I was challenged with this idea of how to tell a story with that kind of depth and breadth in only 5 months. And 5 months with me going back and forth off and on, so I'm not there consistently the whole way through. And what I do is I get to know the person that is the main character, the main subject of the work, and I learn to empathize, listen, like deeply empathically listen to them, empathize, and put myself in their shoes, and also allow their feelings, their persona, and their memory to guide me through the landscape that they inhabit. There was no way that I was going to be able to understand Flint, Michigan at all in 5 months, right? That is a lifetime of an encounter with an automobile city. Only she and her family would have that innate and intimate understanding of that landscape and how their bodies move and shift through that landscape, right? In Notion of Family, I know him from the area called the Bottom, next to the river, which is next to the railway, and the railroad, surrounded by pollution, next to a steel mill. I had to learn by listening to Shay and her driving me around Flint to understand, okay, she's in the 5th Ward. This is one of the most heavily impacted neighborhoods because their water infrastructure is one of the oldest. This is also one of the blackest communities and the most blighted community, and where you see people having moved away because of the collapse of the auto industry. But yet so many of them, they shared all of that memory. Like, we lived here, this is our first house, and then we moved here, and understanding how Amber and Shay grew up together. And I think what was significant about her that helped me understand the landscape and how to navigate it was that she's a school bus driver. And to me, like, Shay is the mayor of Flint, really. Like, her and Amber both should run for mayor because they are such fierce and well-known public figures and champions of that city. So I obsessively followed Shay's school bus routes, and I must have looked like an insane lady. Like, who's this lady stalking the school bus routes all the time? You know, and the kids would be getting off the bus to go home, and there I am sitting in the car looking at the street signs, noticing the different neighborhoods. Like, people don't even realize Flint is not simply a majority Black, poor city. There were homes that have cul-de-sacs with multi-million-dollar homes. There's redevelopment, new development, gentrification, expansion. And this is the other thing that concerned me. And so in Shay's case, the Cobb family, they're not poor. They're not victims, right? They are a quintessential middle-class American family. And the only reason they're losing everything they worked so hard for is because the property value of their family home diminished and decreased due to the failed water infrastructure and now the sewage infrastructure, right? This is how poverty systemically happens, right? That is institutional racism and designed by man, right? It was a governor that denied the democracy of the people who are citizens and taxpayers of that city that voted not to switch to the Flint River, right? And this is something Shay never lets go of, right? In all her poems and all our interviews and all our time together. And when you strip someone's democracy from them, their right to vote, and you silence that by overriding it, and now you've caused the lead to leach into their water system, which went into their homes, which then went into their bodies. I mean, it's so degrading and dehumanizing. It made her feel like she wasn't American, right? And she and her family for generations worked for the same thing. And so the Cobb family, her background, part of her family's from the South. The other side, her mother's side, is from New York, all moving into Flint to work for General Motors in the 60s. I even photographed her father, Leroy Cobb's certificate with General Motors when he graduated in the school and got his promotion working there. And one of the main things that I had to do to drive that point home visually with Shay and Zion is charter a helicopter. And because I followed her bus routes, I knew all the intersections to be at, including her home, including where she studied at the University of Michigan, Flint, right? Another narrative people don't tell, right? She's an educated, fierce woman. So I fly over with my pilot, and she knows where to meet me at each plot mark we have on the map of all the intersections that run parallel to her life and how she navigates that city. And so one of them you see that we're in the 5th Ward, and she and Zion are standing in the garage at the back of their house, looking up at me. So it's this portrait of them, even though they're small in the image, but she's surrounded by her house and her community, and you can see, right, the destruction from this water crisis. And when we met, it was a painful moment because none of her family could occupy the house. But yet, this is where they were raised and spent all their time, and this is where the grandparents passed. And so it was a tumultuous time to enter into her life. And she didn't have to trust me, but I think it goes back to even what I teach my students. You don't arrive with all your equipment looking for this thing as an outsider. You need to be present and talk to people for as long as it takes. And it's not a surprise that the first image Shay and I made was in her bedroom. I had already made it up, and her mom, Miss Renee, doesn't let anybody in the house. And I love her mom, Miss Renee. She reminds me so much of my mother. Very guarded, protective, no nonsense, and will cut you with words at the drop of a hat. So the fact that she let me in the house and invited me and allowed me to go upstairs and even allowed me to do a little wave when she was sitting in her bedroom, because the bedrooms are perpendicular, already showed like this trust and acceptance. And so that first photograph, it is of Shay. Zion is looking out the window. On the dresser are the pictures, these beautiful drawings of her grandparents, Leroy and Hazel, and then Shay is kneeling on her bed doing her aunt Andrea's hair, getting ready for Andrea's daughter, Nefertiti's courthouse wedding. So here's this grand wedding happening in the midst and in the middle of the water crisis. And this is how powerful and resilient the Cobb family is, right? And Shay said, like, don't come here and expect to see us in tattered clothes and as a victim. You know, we're gonna have this wedding, and nobody thinks about a water crisis on a wedding day. And so this was, you know, a real lesson that I'm teaching visually about not only empathizing, but listening and taking the instructions and allowing the images to be authored by someone else. Like, that's a real collaboration. And I also knew to take those cues because I had been closely looking at Ralph Ellison and Gordon Parks' collaboration in the late 40s for Invisible Man. And in that collaboration, Ellison details to Parks the pictorial problem. And in that pictorial problem is a list of certain kinds of images that he would like Parks to make. And so, you know, he's asking him to make images that are both symbol and document, but also images that psychologically impact the viewer. And so understanding that a poet like Ellison, who took photographs but isn't really a photographer, giving these kind of instructions to Parks, well, Shay Cobb is a poet. I'm a photographer. We're two younger women, and here we are 70 years later addressing Ellison's pictorial problem as the instruction for Parks. And so this is why it just seems so effortless in terms of my commitment, not only as a teacher, but also my commitment to Gordon's legacy of understanding how to take the feeling of a place and the feeling of being robbed and dehumanized, or the feeling of the trauma behind institutional racism, are constantly being under siege in America because you're Black, right? How do you convey that to a viewer with an evocative feeling and in an undulating, poetic, visual way, right? And so when you see the collaboration with Ellison, I mean, these are very surreal images that we don't typically see from Parks. And so this collaboration with Shay is a mix between that, right? Her poems, the images, but allowing her to be the one that's determining everything and guiding me, and me simply being that platform and understanding that kind of visual language. I think, you know, when I read Gordon's autobiography, A Choice of Weapons, I mean, everything that he went through, right? To know that he almost lost his life, right? Couldn't comfortably live in a home, families putting him out, and then he's coming all the way to Chicago. Then he goes to Washington, D.C., and realizes all the segregation and racism in the North. The fact that he could go through all of that, nearly lose his life, come to this camera, and to define himself on his own terms, and to say with the camera, this is how I'm gonna make my mark and change all the things that I don't like about America, right? all the things that he hates about the universe and all these kinds of social and economic inequalities. To see him do that was remarkable, and it stays with me because, you know, you can't control the circumstance you're born into. I grew up raised by my grandmother, living in a dilapidated house next to the railroad and watching everyone kind of disappear and the city shrink and have all our basic human rights stripped from us. And as much as that hurt, I found that the healing in that and the ability to cope and move forward through art, right? It started out being drawings and paintings and then eventually moving into photography. But I think that as long as you understand as an artist and an image maker, you're not changing policies and laws, but what you are doing is making these kinds of inequities visually tangible, that you're making a human record, right? A record, you're stacking up all of these things that our government, our politicians, our companies have done to dehumanize poor people, disenfranchised people, right? What does it say in the Bible about what we do to the least? And we see it over and over. And of course, in both our cases, Parks and myself, we are caught up in that before we find this new life with a camera. I think in terms of rendering a social justice, knowing that you're the one making that record so that, like, that camera and all that darkness, negativity, death, sickness, and destruction, that camera is still extracting that light, imprinting on that celluloid, right? Evidence, truth, justice, a fight. Even if the government doesn't want to recognize it, even if the corporate media doesn't want to report on it, you've gone out there as an insurgent on your own terms and have made that evidence real and tangible to stand, you know, the history of time, right? It'll never be erased. It is documented. And it's a gelatin silver print, so it's not going to disappear. The color is not going to change. It's not going to fall apart. So to know that you have that and have made that mark, like, there's the truth, right? And in a way, whenever I'm extracting and making that document and record of people protesting the closure of a hospital, protesting the fact that they're paying the highest water bills, protesting the fact that the government covered up the fact that it was Legionnaire's disease that was killing all the people in the city of Flint. And Governor Snyder wouldn't say it. The fact that there are countless images that are telling the truth, and independent artists like myself willing to tell those stories, I think is the indictment on the system. That is a social justice. And I think in some ways, maybe it's better that we're out there as insurgents on our own doing it, because we're not sanitizing, neutralizing, and trivializing what someone like Shay Cobb would proclaim and say about how she's been dehumanized. And in my case, in the notion of family, those photographs are what enabled me to save my own life, right? It is very simple. If I didn't have those photographs, I wouldn't have been able to pay the light bill, or for books I needed in school, or for when I was, struck down bad with my terminal illness and I had to leave school, take care of myself, right? Those photographs are what afforded me to prolong my life, right? This is my life's work. These aren't projects. There's real lives, real blood depending on that work circulating and being out in the world. And in the case of Flint, what's interesting is that I get to tell this narrative nobody wanted to tell. I mean, I'm rewriting history and writing history. For me, these photographs are about making present history visible today, now. I don't want to wait decades later when it's too late and I can't impact change in someone's life right now. Why should people have to wait till after they're dead and gone to see justice? And why do people have to die and then be photographed in order for civil rights or justice to happen? You know, I mean, it is beyond barbaric that in June of 2019, that the Attorney General of Michigan, after 5 years of an investigation, just decides to drop all criminal charges in this investigation for the Flint Water Crisis, where there were local and state representatives being held accountable, right? The fact that all of a sudden, a change of hands, new votes, a new person takes position, and we just flush all of that 5-year investigation away and don't hold anyone accountable, and the people of Flint have been waiting for 5 years, right? That is justice delayed and justice denied, yet again, in the United States. And this is the thing that I'm talking about in terms of a social justice and fighting these inequities. The fact that I'm making these images at the same time that that could happen is an implication and an indictment. So these photographs run a historic timeline with the present. So even though it's a portrait, say, of Zion brushing her teeth with bottled water, or a portrait of kids standing outside of Northwestern High School with someone wearing a paper mache head of Governor Snyder and a prison suit, jumpsuit, like those images are markers on the timeline that shows how America is really the changing same, right? We didn't end slavery, we didn't end inequality. This is really like being outraged that there was no justice from the civil rights movement for a lot of these industrial small towns that people don't realize are very diverse and that Black and brown bodies dwell in, live in, reside in, right? Who is going to fight and advocate for poor people, for working class people, for people who were migrating and immigrating from other places of famine and war to these small towns in America? A lot of this is my angst for the fact that this country, in terms of its class stratification, doesn't care about anyone, Black, white, or brown, if you are working class or poor. And I think that that's a real prevailing problem with the whole country. And for me, I'm beyond a Black experience. My work is talking about an American experience, period. We're American, and all the things that are happening to us are a direct ramification and a mirror to the rest of the country, right? We're all very connected regardless of race, regardless of class. And again, we see this in Park's work with the Fontenelle family, right? In Life magazine, you see the son on the cover crying, and it is an identical match, right? That's 1968. Fontenelle's son's crying on the cover. 2016, 17, there's Zion with her mouth open, brushing her teeth with bottled water. The fact that those two almost seem like it's the same period, that's so dismal to know that. And to know that we keep brutalizing babies, innocent children. But these kinds of histories, until we eradicate them, we need artists and photographers to keep bringing it up, making it visible, putting it on the front of these covers of all of these major magazines and even within the art world, because it's the same stratification. But in that essay in Life with Parks in 1968, which the theme is about racial inequalities, right? You turn to the first spread, and it has words in Gordon Parks' own words, where he's basically using that essay, puts it in the context of holding a mirror up, right? What you've done to the Fontenelle family and what you do to me is what you do to yourself. And I think that, you know, a nation that keeps touting its dominance and its wealth, like you have so much wealth and it's all about Wall Street, but yet you're spiritually impoverished. Like that's a problem, and I think artists, we're the backbone of the country in that way, and we're definitely the soul of the nation in that way, that we know how to not only be the people that bear witness, But the people that really are the ones that have the moral courage to stand up and say that this isn't right, what you're doing to this community, this population, to this person, to this individual. And I think that the country itself needs to understand how important artists' roles are. You know, I come back to this a lot, where I'm constantly thinking about, you know, only if today was like when Parks was making images, right? Life magazine, Vanity Fair, Vogue, like a real commission, right? Where you are on salary, right? You work full time to make your images. Like that has been stripped away today. And the reason I go through such great length and depth to do what I'm doing with Shay Cobb is because there is no platform like that anymore, right? He had a multiple spreads where images could be run full bleed, where he was inserting his voice where he could or working with the editors the best he could to contextualize the photographs he took. And that was a salaried job, and that's what he got to focus on. Like, I worked 4 other jobs just to be able to do this, right? That was just one commission. I think what is important about the knowledge that I have about his practice and his life is that I was able, right? He left that kind of a blueprint because of his notoriety, because of his success, because of his fame. And I think, like, I would have to really credit this knowledge to Peter Kinhart Jr., to Leslie Parks, and to Jean, you know, his former wife and editor and executor. It was 2 encounters that I had with Jean when Leslie and Peter introduced me to her in 2016. I was just starting the commission for Flint's family, and I really wanted to negotiate a contract on my own terms so that I could have say over each photograph, so I could stop them from cropping them, so I could challenge them if I didn't like the captions they were trying to write, if I didn't like the language they used, if I didn't like the way the journalist was speaking about Miss Renee or Shay's relationship. Like, how could I create my own contract? Because for me, this is what young practitioners don't know, right? They're like, oh my God, I've been chosen to shoot something for the New York Times, hooray, and I'm just gonna sign my rights away? No. If you really want power and control over your photo essay, what Gordon Parks' legacy in life has showed me is that you really have to write your own contract, negotiate and fight for the terms so that you have a real control over that narrative and visual representation. Like, I am visually representing people like how a lawyer represents the plaintiff and their client, right? And that is a real fight. And so this is another answer to the social justice question, because it was important that the way the images, so if you go back to the 10 pages, I negotiated that it would be 10 pages right before the reader gets to the big, colorful fashion spreads, that you couldn't have any ads in them, no ads in between any of the pages, right? And I learned that from the magazine of the year, right? When it went bankrupt and Ellison and Parks' collaboration wasn't published, and then the negatives get caught up in this lawsuit, and then, you know, we have to rely on years later curators and historians piecing it back together. Like, that was something I kept thinking about. Or like Parks' exhibition, The Making of an Argument, where we finally are allowed to have a peer and look behind scene to see how Parks was picking and choosing his battles with these editors. Now we know that Red Jackson was depicted as a villain in that spread, when yet Parks' image is showing him as a human being, as an innocent person, kind of hiding in that shadow, retreating in that shadow with the light hitting him. But the fact that the designer or the editor put this image of like Harlem engulfed and then the Harlem gang leader and making it seem like he's like looking over as this dark, sinister figure in Harlem, like, this is not what Parks' photographs are for, and it's not how they're meant to be used. And so like, this is why I'm so indebted to understanding that legacy and having encountered someone like Jean who was able to tell me some more of those stories behind the scene. And that's what allowed me to really fight in that photo essay for Shay Cobb's voice, her perspective, and the representation. And the other thing is a Harlem diary, a Harlem diary that goes with the Fontenelle family. Well, after that comes out, Parks is commissioned to make that film. But in the film, it's a video that he's clearly directing. He's speaking in that film directly to you and me, directly to the country, right? Like, we have a problem here with how the Fontenelle family is being treated. Because of that video, I was able to then use that as an example to give Shay Cobb the last word in Flint is family. Because it was an online piece and in print, I was able to build out this film, Flint is Family, that enabled me, just like Parks used his photographs and kind of went over it in that Ken Burns effect with his voice coming over it. I was able to do that with Shay. Instead of it being my voice, the photographer's voice, the author voice, that it would be Shay, the subject, speaking on her own terms, in her own language. So opening that video and film with her, where she starts with a 2-minute poem, which is a complete rebuttal and retort to mass media and politicians. And then to go 11 more minutes detailing every day what it means to have to bathe in bottled water, not be able to cook at all, trying to protect her daughter and still pay the highest water bills. And if you fail, the city's trying to call child protective services on you or rip your family apart. I mean, this is crazy that they criminalize something and use it against people. That is inhumane and very unjust. So knowing all of that about what he went through and was up against helped as a guiding force to make my own contract, fight to not have the ads, have uninterrupted spreads, like a real opportunity to control and edit those images, and then to let her have the final word and not leave enough time for them to try to edit that video. So what she said is exactly the way it aired and premiered in their online component of that 5-part series. And that had never, ever been done before. But I wouldn't have known how to do that without the knowledge and the impact that I have of Parks' legacy. It was the year 2000. I was in an intro photo class photographing at a homeless shelter in Erie, Pennsylvania, because that year was the highest population of homeless children in the United States. In Erie, Pennsylvania, which is 30 minutes from where I was studying at Edinburgh University and being trained and taught about the history of social documentary work, but a long-term, lifelong social documentary work, right? So there I am in this shelter seeing it, right? There were families of 6, of 7 that were homeless, like all these families in these homeless shelters, from little babies all the way up to people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, that some were even alone. And so I started going to that shelter. I just felt such a deep concern and empathy for them. And I think also because I've never been afraid to publicly examine my own family. In short, to answer your question, a part of me continuously returning to the theme of family and always focusing on family is the fact that my family was fragmented, was broken. And I never understood why, right? And I think a part of why I continue to do this work is every family I encounter, every country, every county, every municipality, every home I go into, it's like I get a piece of what was taken. I get a piece of what was taken from me and my family back. So that's a personal thing. It never heals me, but there's something about functioning in that realm of different ways of thinking about family. Because as a kid, I was depressed because I didn't, I was raised by my grandmother. My parents weren't there. I didn't live in the same house as my siblings. And you go to school and you want to try to go to college and grad school. Well, the higher you go up in the social ladder, the more you see more nuclear families, and you feel more of an outcast and alienated, and they treat you different because you come from a fragmented family. So every single body of work I make, even if I don't photograph a family, but I spend time with them, that gives me a piece of my humanity back from having my own personal life and family stripped from me. And I couldn't control that, right? I had no control over that. So when you look at, I think one of the most powerful images in a Harlem family, with the Fontenelle family, is when you see the whole family there in the government office there. Are they in the public assistance office? Like, there it is right there. In one image, he shows you symbolically how the state, how the government unravels Black families and their lives. He does it again. Ella Watson, 1942. She's standing. It's not that she's holding the mop and the broom and taking after that famous painting. It's that she's standing in front of the American flag in an office in Washington, D.C. as a Black woman who's a janitor that cleans those offices in a society, a nation, and a government that doesn't recognize her as a full human being. It's all of those layers that he masterfully puts and distills into one portrait about one person, all the societal ills, all the social inequities, always in one portrait. And those portraits stay with me. They stay because they're so true in what he is conveying. As subtle as they are, they're just so powerful and loud, but yet so quiet and somber. And so for me, I'm making those kinds of images that show you structures of power, forces around you that are always at those edges, just trying to dismantle you, trying to destabilize you, trying to strip you of any kind of basic human right. So from the beginning of this nation's inception, it's always been about a continual perpetuation of displacement, dispossession, alienation, dehumanization, and the removal of any kind of basic rights or even a civic dialogue to demand those rights, And I think that, that's why I'll never tire of always looking to Gordon whenever I get lost or stumble or trip or I'm not sure about the way I'm handling something or making an image. I just know it. And when I'm shooting images of people, I will see a Gordon Parks image. I will see a Dorothea Lange image. I will see a Walker Evans image. I will see a Lewis Hine image. I will see a Carrie Mae Weems, a Dawood Bey. I will see them, and I'll know that I'm making that surrogate. I'm making that portrait that's in conversation with all of that legacy, all of that history. I think that that's really important and a mark of an artist who's been mentored by the people that, I just named. So you want to have that conversation with them. And I think that this is a collective. We're all a family. We're all a lineage that is very indebted and responsible and holding ourselves accountable. And so I want to play my part, right? If I was born in an industrial small town, then that's the hand that was dealt. And I know sometimes in these more bourgeois, larger cities, people don't understand that people like me exist. And I'm here to let them know we do. And that's why I make the work of beautiful Black people in these industrial concrete mazes, right, as Ellison put it. We left the South, coming all the way north, thinking that we were going to get to some promised land. And we never got there, right? Just like Invisible Man, just like their collaboration. And this is what you see happening to Shay Cobb. Here she is in the industrial north, having her water poisoned, having to make that reverse migration back south, just like Ellison proclaimed. And so, these are the things that I think about in terms of those portraits that he made and how you deal with society and power and institutions, and why I think he's hiding kernels of that in every single portrait that you look at, in all of his bodies of work. Because I embedded myself in every personal facet and detail of Shay's schedule, one of the routines we had was picking Zion up from school or after school. And I remember going in her charter school, right? This is a charter school in Flint. And I go inside of it and I see the fountain covered up in plastic. And it says, contaminated, do not drink. And I couldn't pick up the camera. It pricked me, it wounded me, it just hit me so hard in the gut, because we know the history of seeing those images. So Gordon captures it in color. You see the woman at the fountain, or the little girls behind the fence and they can't go to the playground, right? You see it. And I think it's even more powerful because it is so colorful, right? It does feel like this innocent, colorful fairy tale, but looming underneath is this nightmare of inequality. And so as soon as I saw the fountain, I was jolted and I froze up and couldn't get the camera. I took it in my mind's eye, and immediately, of course, Park's image of the fountain that say coloreds only or whites only pops up. But I think in the human part of me, it just hurts because you don't want it to be true. And in my spirit, I knew things haven't changed. It looks different, right? It didn't say colored or whites on it. It said contaminated, do not drink, or don't drink, or don't use. To see that in a charter school in 2016 in the United States of America, after everything everybody went through fighting for civil rights, to see it all roll back, like we can physically, tangibly see it, that all of that work, all of those people who marched and died for this, vanished and taken away. The rollback era is real, and we see it at a devastating magnitude in small towns across the United States. So I think I've matured to a point where sometimes it's okay to not take that photograph because it wounds you so much personally, because you don't want it to be true and you want to fight for something better, right? I think Parks wanted to leave the world and society in a better place than what he experienced and what he was born into, right? That's that choice of that weapon. And the fact that there was nothing I could do about it in that moment. I wasn't going to do it because I don't want to show Zion something she already knew, right? Zion, we had to have that conversation. I had to listen and watch Shay have that conversation with her right before she's doing her homework. And again, another image of Parks comes to mind. Fontenelle family. You see the kids studying. I don't care how much systematically your humanity has been stripped from you, they can never take your knowledge. Even if you had to borrow that book from somebody else, or even if that book doesn't have anything written about your own will and victory and triumph. Parks intentionally always photograph kids with books. And that's why I'm sitting there on the bed with Shay and Zion, while Shay, you see her right at the edge of the frame, looking at Zion, and Zion sitting there looking up at me because telepathically, like, knowledge is power. And I'm making that photograph, inscribing this photograph for her to have in her memory so she knows, just like Parks did for the Fontenelle kids, knowledge is power. And it doesn't matter how impoverished you are, you can still study. Or letting Americans know that. Just because someone has been stripped of any type of economic power doesn't mean they're not intelligent or that they don't study. And then, of course, in my photograph, right to the left of Zion and the viewer's right, you see the still life of the glass water jug filled with alkaline water. And right next to that, you see a plastic water bottle filled with water. So, you know, these are the kinds of images that I think are important to make in conversation with that history and context. So, you know, for a few years now, I've just kind of been spinning my wheel here. Like, what's it gonna take for me to make a platform that empowers and enables everyday people to mediate and tell their own story? And again, I, in this strange way, have this nostalgia for thinking about how life was a platform for Parks. And then, of course, once that weighed on him so much, and I think they probably really made him upset a few times, and I've also gotten very angered in many meetings lately with editors in New York. The fact that he left and went to Paris and was doing fashion and shooting color, and then the Learning Tree, oh my God. What an incredible film. It's just such an incredible film. I would like to make my own film. And I've, you know, been patiently waiting, waiting to mature, be wiser, waiting for all the right parts and pieces to be in the right place and for the right healthy relationships. And I think that's also what I admire about him. It seemed like no matter where he was with the steps he was taking, there was always the right people right there to encourage him or to support him. Which is why I don't think it's a coincidence that, Peter Kendhart Jr. enters into my life in 2015, and then we take off from there as friends and me seeing Parks' archives and work. But I think about making films often, but there's also this part where I'm thinking, well, Hollywood and films and large films are also difficult, and we live in an era where people are more used to mini docs, small things. And so I do daydream about this, like if you take the show Democracy Now! And turn it into a platform where you're democratizing art. So I want to make my own art democracy now, where I go from state to state, small town to small town, collaborating with families, workers, right? Whether they're auto workers or farmers, whether they're Black, white, Latina, or immigrated from somewhere else, as many different people as possible. I'm really committed to this idea of class consciousness and of creating a movement through solidarity of all backgrounds, but wanting to build it from the bottom up, right, the ground up. I'm very interested in that, and I think the only way to do that is to continue to build this archive that I'm already building. And each body of work, in my case, has led to the next one. It's not a coincidence that I went from working in Flint, Michigan for 4 years with the Cobb family to just slightly pivoting to going into Northeast Ohio, into Lordstown, where I photographed many families who were dealing with the plight of the fact that their parent or loved one was laid off by General Motors, right? Each body of work leads to the next. When I came out of Borinage, Belgium, photographing the coal miners, talking about their memory, how they migrated, and showing how industry creates a subculture across, right? In Belgium, they were Belgian, Italian, and Turkish working in those coal mines, all in one community. By the time we created that body of work in 2 years, it led me to go back home to Pittsburgh, where I photographed a woman named Sandra Gold Ford, who had the foresight and knowledge to photograph Jones and Laughlin Steel, which is Andrew Carnegie's competitor in Pittsburgh for steel, right? It all comes full circle. All that steel was used in large coils of steel in Lordstown to make the molds for the car, the Cruise sedan. So it's all full circle, following global economy, steel, coal, all the materials that we rely on in this country. And by looking at following the capital and the global capital and the economy and the shifting industries is how I meet the workers and then go into their homes and meet their families. So I create this whole new diverse universe of working class people, and then make their stories overlap or show how much they overlap, that they see themselves in each other, which visually creates a unification, a solidarity. And then intellectually and ideologically, I argue for this type of class consciousness. And I think this is a complementary aspect and element to what Parks was doing, or what all those artists in Harlem were doing. Because you can't talk about race without talking about class. And this country needs to see that, right? And I don't think it's ironic that we're now looking back at Fred Hampton Jr., thinking about his life, right? People wanting to make films and teach young folks about who Fred Hampton Jr. is. I think about him and Parks because I'm in Chicago. You know, what would that have looked like if they encountered each other or he made a portrait of Fred Hampton Jr.? Like, to me, that's like my ideological worlds colliding, you know? And I think if you care about humanity, you have to address class along with race. Because when you do, they expose how capitalism divides and conquers all of us, period. And how you see so many people living below the poverty line in the world's most wealthiest nation, which is definitely not a superpower anymore. And these are troubling, tumultuous times, and I think it's so important to create another type of complex narrative storytelling on multiple mediated platforms, free from the kind of elitist bourgeois or like control of one particular demographic controlling the stories. I mean, the thing that disturbed me at Hearst Corporation is when I went into the offices of Elle, you look over all those cubicles, they were all white women. And I'm like, well, how are you about to tell a story about Shay Cobb if you have no cultural sensitivity to everything that compromised her and put her in this situation in the first place? There's no understanding of that. They don't come from that social order or social world of an industrial middle-class family that used to work for the auto industry. People actually think that people like that don't exist anymore. It becomes the driving force to why I get up every single day and make a poignant decision to make work that is beyond what I look like, right? It is time for people to understand, if they're gonna talk about my work, that they don't see it through this very narrow lens of saying, LaToya makes photographs about Black people. No, I don't. I make photographs about human beings, right? I make photographs about Americans. I make photographs about people that are caught up in these complex intersections and situations revolving around industry, labor, capital, shifting economies, shifting landscapes, the environment, healthcare, education, all of these things that really show how we're divided and conquered and subjugated to always blame each other instead of this larger apparatus that is hanging over our heads, which leftist economists might call neoliberalism, that is fallen apart and is taking this new shift with this rise of fascism coupled with that on steroids. But I think it's important to show up for as many people as possible, whether I speak their language or not. When I was in Borinage, Belgium, I had a translator. I was a stranger in their village and had the audacity to show up. They all knew my work, but the first thing these men said to me, "Why are you here? You're an American, you're a woman, and you're Black. Why do you care about us?" And I just smiled at them. Most people would have retreated in fear. I thought it was great. Because I was like, man, you sound just like all the people that I used to see my grandmother and my mother's age in Braddock, right? After the industry was closed, after everything went overseas, when people, like they became disillusioned. That kind of feeling that comes from someone that's a coal miner or a steel mill worker, and they're very confrontational and direct, which I love. As a Pittsburgher, I must say, that's where we get all our sensibility from. So they were actually speaking my language. It didn't scare me, even though I didn't speak French or Italian French, since a majority of them were Italian. But people didn't know that, right? Here I am in the coal mining region of the Borinage in Belgium, where I encountered a whole community of Italian people that migrated there fleeing fascism, poverty, and war in 1948. They signed a contract. There was a contract between Belgium and Italy where they would take the families if they signed a contract and were basically traded for the value of one bag of coal. And when one of the coal miners' daughters explained that to me, she simply just said, we felt ashamed, embarrassed that this was the value of our life. And this is why I make my work regardless of someone's race, creed, religion, sexuality. It's about that, their humanity, the value of someone's life. Because at this point, the way that capitalism has us all in a chokehold, we are literally trying to validate the value of our right to live and exist and to have basic things like food, water, shelter, land, just anywhere to simply occupy or be, right? And so I think, again, it's complementary and comes full circle to everything Parks was saying. In his time, he had to deal with because of his circumstance and what happened to him and how he nearly escaped the South and all the things he had to endure and the awful realizations he had to face in the North, just like King had to come to terms with it, right? Everybody always thinks, oh yeah, the North, we'll prosper there, we'll be accepted there. No, you won't. You're gonna find yourself institutionally locked out, as usual. And I think that it is my responsibility to couple that with understanding issues around class, the value of human life, and an ecosystem that we're seeing vanish before our eyes. There's a few things happening in the two portraits that you saw me make today, and specifically that one in the dining room table. First of all, I hadn't photographed them at that table. There is a still life shot, right, an interior of that space currently on view at SF MoMA in Flint is Family Part 2. But to have them sit there, to continue to build on this part 2, to give it the real breadth and depth that it needs. The last time that I was there to visit, I saw a very tender moment between Shay and her father, Mr. Smiley. I noticed for the first time Shay noticing her father's fragility. I don't think it had hit her until that last visit we were together. And I felt that it hit her in a deep way, to the point that, it was one of those feelings in my gut. And so I excused myself and went into the room to leave her alone with her father, because I figured they needed to have father-daughter time to talk about the future. And so knowing that I'm building this human document and archive for Zion to inherit, like she's going to inherit all that land and the fresh water spring, I think it's important to make that image for her, because she's too young to understand what that means when you're a child dealing with a parent's mortality, right? She's not going to understand that yet. She'll have about 20 more years. And so I think that shot at the dining room table today was almost like, it's similar to when my grandmother is in the notion of family in the kitchen, and JC, the young cousin of mine that I photographed as a double of myself at that age. He's sitting in the chair looking straight forward. And my grandmother is having a difficult morning. I didn't realize she had pancreatic cancer. So she's actually dying in that image, and I just don't know because she never told me. And you see her gown is draped off her shoulder. She has one of those necklaces on where you press the button if you fall. And her hand gently touches the back of that chair. And JC looks forward. So understanding in a simple way of a passing of a baton, right? A shifting of power, a moving of that elder-wise spirit into that younger adolescence that is gonna have to grapple with that. That photograph was about me understanding, having been witness to a very painful moment where Shay knows I need to be here more for my father. I need to take after him, look after him, help him with this land, help him with the horses, right? Understanding that he knows death is always around the corner for all of us. He knows that. He even makes jokes about it. He did it today, over and over, right? There's all this beautiful humor in understanding our fate. And so in that shot, that's why Shay is sitting perpendicular or to the side profile of my lens and where I'm standing. The person who's front and center across from that lens is Mr. Smiley. And then you've got Zion to his left, in between Shay and him, with her arms around all that history that she's about to inherit, right? She may not know it, just like my grandmother, a woman of few words, very stern, discipline me, no nonsense, you better study. Mr. Smiley's the same way with Zion. That's what it was like when I first visited him and looked at him, always disciplining and correcting and looking after her. He doesn't have to put it in any words. It's about his presence. So I'm capturing that moment. So when she's my age, she's gonna look at that photograph and it's gonna make her remember. We may not understand what that photograph means now, but I bet you 2 decades from now, the fact that that's gonna jog her memory and serve a purpose, maybe she'll be going down the wrong direction, maybe she'll be stuck between decisions, and she'll see that photograph, whether it's in a museum, in a book, or in her own home. That kind of power of Mr. Smalley and Shay being the guards of who is so young and precious, but about to become this victor that has to triumph over all this inequality, right? She has no idea the load that she's about to have to carry, but she's gonna be able to do it because that image is there to reinforce and remind her, like, this is what you do, right? So if she loses herself, she's confronted with that portrait, she sees that she's looking. That's why I said, look at me, Zion. She's looking into the lens at me, where she's gonna be my age looking at that image, right? So I'm talking to her 2 decades from now. And then Shay and Mr. Smalley are touching by holding hands on that glass table that's reflecting them, looking at each other. So there's the triangle, there's the power dynamic. And so I'm writing that history for her so that she can survive in the future, whether she knows that or not. And the other thing about the photographs is they really will be used to invest in her future, which is, I think, a part that Parks also played, right? When you think about what he did for Flavio, he took care of him. The photographs enabled him, right? His fame, his success, the circulation of that work enabled him to financially provide for Flavio. Just like he made America so compelled that they sent all that money in for the Fontenelle family to move to that house in Long Island. Since that platform doesn't exist for me today to compel, right? People aren't compelled anymore. Nobody gave me money for Flint's family. None of those editors or magazines or corporations paid Shay for living her trauma on their printed page. How is she supposed to be compensated for that? And how am I holding myself accountable to ensure that she be repaid for that? So what people don't know about these photographs and all of the bodies of work I made, all of that, when those works are acquired, sent into all those museum collections, a portion of that money is given back to the people in the work. I've been doing it the entire time.